What if Yahweh wasn't the first God of the Bible for many? This question sounds absurd, perhaps even heretical. But once you begin digging into ancient texts, archaeological findings, and forgotten scriptures, a deeper, more controversial truth emerges, a truth that shakes the foundations of what millions have believed for centuries. We've been taught that Yahweh was always the one and only God, the eternal, unchanging, sovereign being from the beginning of time. But what if this wasn't always the case? What if Yahweh's exclusivity was not a divine revelation, but a result of historical editing, political control, and theological reform? The story that unfolds takes us back to the earliest layers of religious thought long before monotheism was established. A time when gods weren't singular, they were plural, they were many, and they included names that you may never have heard before: El, Baal, Asherah. The first clue comes from the Hebrew language itself. In the very first verse of Genesis, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But the original Hebrew says Elohim, a word that is grammatically plural. It literally means gods. Yet the verb used is singular, created. This creates a strange tension, a plural noun acting as a singular subject. This is not a grammatical accident. It's a theological puzzle. Why would the Bible begin with a plural term to describe the Creator? Could this suggest that the ancient Israelites once believed in a council of gods, a divine assembly, not unlike the pantheons of the Babylonians, Canaanites, or Egyptians? This idea isn't new to scholars. Psalm 82, for instance, openly describes Yahweh standing in the assembly of the gods. He judges among the Elohim. This passage implies Yahweh was one among many, at least at one point in time. He had authority, yes, but not necessarily exclusivity. The biblical world, contrary to modern monotheistic assumptions, was not born in religious singularity. It was forged in the fires of competition among gods, cults, and ideologies. The ancient Middle East was a cauldron of deities. In Mesopotamia, you had Enlil, Enki, and Marduk. In Egypt, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Ra. In Canaan, the very land where the Hebrews settled, the dominant deities were El, the Most High God, Baal, the storm and fertility god, and Asherah, the powerful divine mother goddess. Let's stop and reflect on this. Even the name Israel ends with El, a direct reference to El, the Canaanite god. And throughout early Hebrew texts, the name Elohim appears hundreds of times, not just as a general term for God, but as a reflection of the divine plurality embedded in the ancient mindset. But these other gods, they didn't vanish by accident. They were systematically removed, transformed, or demonized. It was not theology alone, it was power, politics, and narrative control. Take Asherah, for example. She was a revered mother goddess in Canaanite religion. But more than that, there is archaeological evidence, actual ceramic inscriptions from sites in ancient Judah that refer to Yahweh and his Asherah. That's right. These inscriptions suggest that Asherah wasn't just a pagan goddess, she was once considered Yahweh's consort. Think about the implications of that. A divine couple, masculine and feminine, father and mother, together. Not alone. But such a vision didn't fit the mold of the emerging patriarchal religion. Monotheism needed singularity and masculinity. The feminine divine had to go. That's why Asherah's name was turned into a taboo. Her sacred trees were torn down. Her symbols were declared idolatry. But she never truly disappeared. She was buried beneath centuries of redaction and silence. And then there's Baal, painted in the Bible as the ultimate villain, the enemy of Yahweh. But that wasn't always the case. Originally, Baal was a god of fertility, rain, and harvest, the very things that sustained ancient life. He was deeply beloved, worshipped, and, in many parts of Israel, widely followed. But Baal's worship became politically inconvenient. He was too popular, too rooted in daily life. So religious authorities rewrote his role. From beloved rain god to demonic idol. From Lord of life to enemy of God. The irony? The very imagery used to describe Yahweh, later rider of clouds, bringer of storms, voice of thunder, was originally Baal's imagery. Yahweh didn't just replace Baal, he absorbed him. So, what does all of this mean? It means that the rise of Yahweh as the only God was not an instant divine revelation. It was a gradual process of selection, synthesis, and suppression. Yahweh, in many ways, became the other gods. He inherited their symbols, their traits, even their names. He absorbed El. He took Baal's thunder. He erased Asherah's touch. And the Bible? It reflects this long, tangled journey, with contradictions, with double meanings, with plural words in singular stories. So now the question is not whether Yahweh is real, or whether the Bible is sacred. The question is, what was hidden and why? Because once we understand that Yahweh rose among other gods, chosen and shaped by human hands as much as by divine mystery, we can begin to see the Bible not as a static book, but as a living testimony of a people wrestling with God, searching, rewriting, remembering and forgetting. And that's just the beginning. To truly understand the rise of Yahweh, we must first understand those who came before him, the gods whose names once echoed through ancient temples, whose symbols adorned sacred sites, whose stories shaped early spirituality. These were not imaginary beings. They were real elements of belief systems that coexisted, overlapped, and eventually collided with what we now call monotheism. Let's begin with El, perhaps the most misunderstood and forgotten deity in Western religious memory. El was the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon. He was called El Elyon, the Most High God. He was the creator of heaven and earth, the father of all gods and men. His image was that of a wise elder, seated on a high throne, ruling with calm authority. He wasn't a warrior or a storm god. He was the source, the ancient wellspring of divinity from which others emerged. What's striking is that El is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. His name is embedded in biblical names like Israel, Samuel, Daniel, Emmanuel, all ending with Zel, signaling a direct spiritual lineage to this ancient deity. And in the earliest texts of the Old Testament, El and Yahweh often appear side by side, sometimes even as separate entities. One such instance is found in Deuteronomy 30 to 2:8-9, where the Most High El Elyon divides the nations, assigning Yahweh his portion, Israel. This paints a theological picture where El presides as head of the divine assembly, and Yahweh functions as a subordinate deity assigned a specific people group. In the Ugaritic texts discovered in the 20th century, some of the most important archaeological finds. In understanding Canaanite religion, El is depicted as the patriarch of the gods, and his consort is none other than Asherah. Together, they produce divine offspring, including Baal, the storm god. This divine family mirrors structures seen in many ancient religions: a father god, a mother goddess, and divine children who carry specific roles: fertility, war, wisdom, death, rebirth. Now here's the crucial question. What happened when the Israelites settled in Canaan, a land already rich in spiritual tradition and saturated with the worship of El, Baal, and Asherah? The answer is not a clean break or a full rejection. Instead, what we see is a fusion, a synthesis, a process that scholars call syncretism. Yahweh, initially a war deity of the desert, gradually absorbs the identity of El, inherits his titles, and eventually replaces him in the public imagination. This was not an isolated incident in religious history. The Greeks absorbed local gods into the Olympian system. The Romans renamed and repackaged Greek gods to suit their pantheon. Even within Christianity, many pagan traditions were Christianized. But in the case of Yahweh and El, something deeper happened. The fusion was covered up. El did not remain as a separate figure. He was swallowed, and his memory hidden beneath layers of redacted scripture and evolving theology. So when you read titles like El Shaddai, El Elyon, or El Roy in the Bible, you are seeing the fingerprints of a forgotten God. A God whose identity now lies buried within the figure of Yahweh. But El was not the only deity to be rewritten. Perhaps the most vilified of all was Baal. To most readers of the Bible, Baal is a villain, a false god, a threat to righteousness, a demonic figure whose worship must be utterly destroyed. But this is not how Baal began. In Canaanite religion, Baal was the god of rain, storms, fertility, and life itself. For an agricultural people, Baal was essential. He was the one who brought the rains that fed the crops, who made the earth bloom, who ensured survival. The very word Baal means Lord or Master. In fact, this title was so common that even Yahweh was once referred to using it. But over time, Baal transitioned from title to name, and from name to symbol of idolatry. Why? Because Baal's popularity was too strong, his worship too entrenched. People didn't want to give him up. His festivals were vibrant, marked by music, dance, fertility rites, and communal feasts. His presence was woven into the rhythm of everyday life. And so, in order for Yahweh to rise to dominance, Baal had to be demonized. Biblical texts began portraying Baal as the enemy. Altars to Baal were torn down. Prophets like Elijah staged confrontations, such as the legendary battle on Mount Carmel, where Baal's priests were defeated by Yahweh's fire. These stories served a purpose: to delegitimize Baal and consolidate religious power under Yahweh. But a deeper look reveals something fascinating. Yahweh began to look like Baal. Descriptions of Yahweh riding the clouds, speaking in thunder, commanding the storms, these are direct copies of Baal's original attributes. In Psalm 29, Yahweh's voice breaks the cedars and shakes the wilderness, a clear echo of Baal's storm god imagery. The people may have stopped using Baal's name, but they did not stop longing for what Baal represented: nature's rhythm, fertility, prosperity, and tangible connection to the earth. So rather than eradicate Baal's essence, Yahweh's image was reconstructed to include it. It was a theological appropriation, Baal's power under Yahweh's name. This allowed religious leaders to preserve elements of their ancestral spirituality while reshaping public worship into a monotheistic form. And yet, perhaps the most tragic erasure of all was that of the divine feminine Asherah. Asherah was not just a goddess. She was the goddess, the queen of heaven, the mother of all, the one who stood beside El in ancient texts and beside Yahweh in early Israelite inscriptions. Her name appears repeatedly in the Bible, but always in a negative context. She's associated with sacred trees, with high places, and with abominable practices. But the very existence of these repeated prohibitions tells us something crucial. She was everywhere. People worshipped her, prayed to her, built sacred poles in her honor, and carved her symbols into temple artifacts. Archaeologists have unearthed inscriptions dating to the 8th century BCE that read, "Blessed be Yahweh and his Asherah." These are not fringe artifacts. They were found in places where Israelites lived and worshipped. These inscriptions tell a story not of heresy, but of a once legitimate belief that the divine included both male and female. So what happened? Asherah was too dangerous, not because she was evil, but because she was powerful. A god with a goddess challenges patriarchal authority. A male deity who shares power with a female counterpart suggests balance, not domination. And in the emerging monotheism of ancient Judah, there was no room for shared power. The religious hierarchy dominated by male priests needed a solitary male god. And so Asherah was erased, not just from the altar, but from the collective memory. The Bible's editors turned her from a goddess into a symbol of corruption. Her sacred trees became abominations. Her high places were torn down, and her name was virtually forgotten. But not entirely. She still lives in the roots of words, in the fragments of pottery, in the echoes of forbidden stories, and in the questions that people, especially women, have begun to ask. Where is the feminine divine? Where is the mother in our vision of God? Because a god without a goddess is not just theologically incomplete, it is spiritually imbalanced. And so, we are left with this truth. The God of Israel did not emerge in a vacuum. He rose in a spiritual landscape rich with competing voices El, Baal, Asherah. And in his rise, he absorbed, refrained, and replaced them. But they never truly disappeared. They linger in names, in verses, in broken inscriptions, and in the buried layers of belief. To know Yahweh fully, we must know who came before him. To understand monotheism, we must confront the plurality that preceded it. And to reclaim a fuller picture of the sacred, we must listen for the voices that were silenced the gods before Yahweh. What does this mean for our faith today? Now that the veil has been lifted, now that we've seen how names were changed, gods were erased, scriptures were rewritten, and entire books were excluded, the question stands before us, clear and unshakable. What does this change about our faith? How do we return to the Bible, knowing it is not the frozen word of a single voice, but the mosaic of many voices, some remembered, many silenced? How do we worship Yahweh, knowing he was once among many gods, that his image was formed through centuries of absorption, editing, and transformation? At first, Such revelations can feel like an earthquake. The very ground of belief seems to tremble. The God we thought we knew begins to blur, expand, even contradict himself. For some, it may feel like betrayal. For others, a moment of liberation. But let us be clear. This is not the end of faith. It is the beginning of something more mature, more honest, more powerful. Because real faith does not crumble under questions. It grows stronger. It stops being inherited and starts becoming chosen. We've been told that the Bible is perfect, that it is closed, that nothing can be added or taken away. And yet, we now know things have been taken away, entire books, entire deities, entire dimensions of the divine. So what does that mean? It means that the Bible is not less sacred. It is more human and therefore, paradoxically, more holy. Because in its contradictions, its edits, its layers, it becomes the spiritual diary of a people wrestling with God. We see a community asking deep questions. Who is God? Where does he come from? Why does he sometimes act with love and other times with fury? Why does he once walk with men and later hide behind fire and cloud? These are not easy questions, but the Bible doesn't hide them. In fact, they are written into the very structure of the text. Multiple creation stories, conflicting commandments, names that change, prophets who contradict each other, songs that praise and psalms that rage. It's not chaos, it's honesty. And now, you too can be honest. Honest enough to admit that what we were taught may not be the whole story. Honest enough to say, I don't just want a God who was handed to me, I want to know the God who is. And here's the beauty. When you go deeper beyond the edits, beyond the canon, beyond the limits, you don't find emptiness. You find fullness, a divine presence not confined to one name, one shape, or one gender, but pulsing through all of history, all of creation, all of consciousness. You find a Yahweh who is more than just a name, a God who includes El's wisdom, who carries Baal's thunder, who once stood beside Asherah's sacred tree. You find not a single being seated alone on a heavenly throne, but a symphony of sacredness, a dynamic and mysterious divine reality that cannot be boxed or branded. And this changes everything. It changes how we read the Bible, not as a final word, but as a beginning, a conversation, a portal into the divine human journey. It changes how we pray, not to a distant monarch, but to a living, layered presence who has been with humanity in many forms, under many names. It changes how we see ourselves, not as children of a jealous God, but as seekers of truth, pilgrims walking ancient paths toward modern clarity. It changes how we see others, not as wrong for calling God by another name, but as fellow wanderers who may be carrying pieces of the same divine mystery. And perhaps, most importantly, it changes how we understand power. Because the suppression of other gods was not just a theological act, it was a political one. Monotheism centralized authority. It erased the feminine. It silenced dissent. It merged religion with empire, priesthood with kinghood. And that model still echoes today in churches, governments, institutions that demand loyalty not to truth, but to control. But once you see behind the curtain, you cannot unsee. Once you hear the voices of the erased gods, you begin to understand that God has never been silent, only edited. And so, What will you do now? Will you return to the shallow version of faith, where questions are feared and complexity is avoided? Or will you step deeper into a faith that is not built on certainty but on courage? Courage to explore what was hidden. Courage to reclaim what was forbidden. Courage to believe in a God who is bigger than a book, wider than a tradition, more inclusive than any one religion. A God who existed before Yahweh. A God who breathed through El, thundered through Baal, gave life through Asherah. A God who still whispers in sacred texts, broken tablets, lost scrolls, and the spaces between the lines. You now have eyes to see and ears to hear, and that is no small thing. It means you are not just a believer. You are a witness. You are part of a generation waking up not to abandon faith, but to revive it. To strip away the manipulation, the edits, the fear, and rediscover the divine as it always was. Mysterious, plural, dynamic, alive. And that brings us back to Yahweh not as an idol of exclusivity, but as a portal into something eternal. A face among many faces, a name among many names, a beginning but not the end. Because God has never been a static image, God is movement, God is revelation, God is relationship. And now, your relationship with the divine is no longer inherited. It is chosen. It is real. You are no longer bound by the edits of ancient scribes. You are free to read the Bible with open eyes, to seek the lost gods, to honor the divine feminine, to embrace the questions, to reclaim the stories, to love what is true, even when it challenges what you once believed. This is not destruction. This is resurrection. Your faith is not dying. It is being reborn. And from this point forward, you will never again see the scriptures the same way. Because now you know. You know that gods were erased. You know that texts were rewritten. You know that Yahweh became one by absorbing the many. You know that what you were told was sacred truth was often carefully shaped truth. And yet, you are still here, still seeking, still yearning, still opening your soul to what is holy. That is real faith. That is real spirituality. And now, the journey truly begins. What if the truth was never lost, only buried? As we've uncovered today, the story of Yahweh is deeper, older, and more mysterious than we were ever told. But this is just the beginning. If this video stirred something in you, questions, curiosity, or even discomfort, don't walk away. Lean in. Ask more. Seek deeper. Subscribe now to join this journey into forbidden texts, erased gods, and the real spiritual history the world tried to forget. Drop a comment what shocked you most. What did you never know until now? And if you believe others deserve to know the unfiltered truth behind religion and the Bible, share this video. Until next time, stay awake, stay questioning, and above all, stay free.